Let's finally implement object-oriented programming now, and starting with constructor functions. And as always, I already have the starter files open here in my VS Code editor. So please go ahead and do the same now. And we can actually already also open up a new terminal and start our live server. So we can close that, open up the console here, increase it a little bit. And now we're all set up and ready to go. So we actually kind of used object-oriented programming before, but in a very limited way, because we had no way of programmatically creating objects. And so all we did was to use some simple object literals, for example, in the Bankist app, right? But now that all changes with constructor functions. So we can use constructor functions to build an object using a function. Now, a constructor function is actually a completely normal function. The only difference between a regular function and a function that we call constructor function is that we call a constructor function with the new operator. But enough talk, let's now actually create a constructor function for a person. So that's person, and in OOP there is this convention that constructor functions always start with a capital letter. And so we should always follow that convention too. And in fact, other built-in constructors like array or map follow that convention as well. Now here I'm using a function expression, but of course a function declaration will also work. Now an arrow function will actually not work as a function constructor. And that's because it doesn't have its own this keyword, and we need that. Okay, so only function declarations and function expressions. Now remember that this function is basically going to produce an object, and in this case for a person. So we want the person to have a name, or let's say a first name, and a birth year. And so we specify these two parameters for that here in our constructor function so that we can then pass in the name and the birth year. And now let's actually call this function. And so, as I said previously, the only difference between a regular function and a constructor function is that we call the constructor using the new keyword. So we write new, then person, and then let's pass in Jonas and 1991, let's say. So this new operator here is actually a very special operator, because what it does is to call this function here, so this person function, but it does a whole lot more than just that. So let's see what exactly happens when we call a function with the new operator like this. So behind the scenes, there happen 4 steps. And let me actually write them here because this is very important. So first, a new empty object is created. So an empty object is created. Then afterwards, the function is called, and in this function call, the this keyword will be set to this newly created object. All right, so let's write that here. So the this keyword is this new empty object. So basically, in the execution context of the person function, the this keyword will point to this new object here that was created in step number 1. And remember, all of this happens only because we are calling the function using the new operator here. So step number 3 is that this newly created object is linked to a prototype. So linked to prototype, but more about this in the next video. For now, we just care about creating the object itself. Finally, the last step is that the object that was created in the beginning is then automatically returned from the constructor function. So the function automatically returns that empty object from the beginning. But actually, at this point, the object no longer needs to be empty. And this is actually the trick of making the constructor function work. So let's go here now and log to the console the this keyword. And so we already know that it should be this empty object that was just created here in step number 1, right? Because the this keyword inside this function will be exactly that empty object. And again, that's because we are calling it with the new keyword. So let's see. And indeed, we get this empty object. And the browser console is actually already telling us that it's basically here of the type person. All right. And so this is just the name of the constructor function. All right. And now let's use this knowledge to our advantage, because we already know that in the end of this function, the this keyword will basically be returned. And so whatever we add to that empty object will then be returned from the function. And that returned object is going to be the object that we are trying to build here actually. So all we need to do is to now take that first name parameter, so the value that we receive, and then create a property on the this keyword with the same name, and then set it to that value. And then the same with the birth year equal to birth year. And so now let's store the result here in some variable, and that's actually it. So let's see what Jonas is going to look like. Now, and we have to log it to the console here if we want to take a look at it. And indeed, here it is. Here is the person object with the first name Jonas and the birth year that we passed here into the constructor function. So let's quickly recap what just happened here. So again, we're calling this constructor function with the new keyword or the new operator. And so therefore, a new empty object is created right away. Then the function is called, and in here, the this keyword is that empty object. And then in the function, we start to set properties to that object. And we give them the exact same name as the parameters that we're passing in here. And of course, they could have any other name, so it doesn't have to be the same name as our arguments. So it doesn't have to be the same name as our parameters, but this is kind of a convention. So if we pass in first name, then we should also create a property called first name. So then here, by the end of the function, or this keyword now has these two new properties. And then here in step number 4, that object that was created in the beginning is then automatically returned from the function. And so at this point, that is the object with these two properties. And so that's going to be the result of this function call. And so it will then be stored in Jonas. And then that's what we get here. Great. So I hope that made sense. And so now, of course, we can use this constructor function to create as many different objects as we want. So let's say we want to create Matilda, new person, Matilda, and then let's say 2017. And let's just do another one. Why not? Let's call it Jack, new person, just so you see that we can create as many objects now based on this constructor function. And so this is a bit like the analogy from before, where this constructor function is now the blueprint for a house, and then each of these objects that we create through that function, so through that blueprint, will be the actual house in the real world. So in this case, the actual objects with actual data in them. So Matilda and Jack. And so of course, now each of them is its own new object that we created programmatically using a function constructor. Now remember from one of the previous lectures that in classical object-oriented programming, an object created from a class is called an instance, right? Now, we didn't technically create a class here because, as we discussed before, JavaScript doesn't really have classes in the sense of traditional OOP. However, we did create an object from a constructor function, and actually 3 objects, right? And constructor functions have been used since the beginning of JavaScript to kind of simulate classes. And so therefore, we can still say that Jonas here is an instance of person. And the same goes for Matilda and for Jack here. And in fact, there is even an operator that we can use to test for that. So that works like this. So Jonas is an instance of, and then person. And so this will then return either true or false. Now, if we created something else here, let's say J, just like this, then if we do this, this should of course be false, right? Because of course we didn't create this variable here, so this object, using any constructor function. All right. And since we're talking about instances here, we can also say that these properties here will be the instance properties. Let's write that here. And that's because the properties first name and birth year will be available on all the instances that are created through this constructor function. So that's for properties. But now what about methods? So what if we wanted to add a method to our objects? Well, just like we added properties, we can of course also add methods. So let's again use our old friend calc_h here. And so here we are going to create a function and assign it to this property. And so this will then basically become a method, right? And this here should simply log to the console 2037, which is the year we've always been using, and then minus this dot birth year. And so this method is exactly the same that we've been using all the time, right? So this would work just fine here, but this is actually a really bad practice. So you should never do this. You should never create a method inside of a constructor function. That's because imagine we were going to create 100 or thousands or even tens of thousands of person objects using this constructor function. Then what would happen is that each of these objects would carry around this function here. So if we had 1,000 objects, we would essentially create 1,000 copies of this function. And so that would be terrible for the performance of our code. Again, don't do this. But instead, to solve this problem, we are going to use prototypes and prototypal inheritance, just like we discussed in the last video. All right, great. So this is the basics of constructor functions. Just note that function constructors are not really a feature of the JavaScript language. Instead, they are simply a pattern that has been developed by other developers, and now everyone simply uses this. And this now includes you as a new developer. So the real magic really here is this new operator. And so the most important thing to understand from this video is really these 4 steps. So make sure that you understand them, and then in the next video we will work with prototypes and finally see the magic of prototypal inheritance in action.